I'd like to welcome everyone to the Northfield Village Council public meeting tonight at 6:30. Can I rise for the pledge, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this time, I'm going to pass the meeting over to the Law Director, Mr. Brad Bryan.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's great to see everyone this evening, and I would like to introduce Rita McMahon from Aceland Consulting, who is the village's planning consultant for the Overlay District project. And Rita will be giving a presentation regarding the project, its history, and how we've gotten where we are, and what the current draft of the proposal involves. And after she'll walk through the proposed provisions, and after she's finished, we'll take questions and any comments from anyone here this evening. Council rules limit questions and comments to 5 minutes per person. We will try to adhere to that, but we welcome everyone's input. Rita?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here tonight to talk about what we've been working on with the council over the last about almost 6 months now, about how to basically do some things on their zoning ordinance to make some improvements, to allow some improvements to occur in the Northfield Road corridor. When the council originally contacted me and I responded to their request for proposals, their direction was that they felt that there were a lot of things going on that were very positive for the village, and that they needed to do some things that hopefully in their regulations to help encourage some additional growth and development in the corridor, and to allow reinvestment and redevelopment of some of the properties that are the commercial properties that are along the corridor. And when we started out, I said, well, let me kind of take a look as an outsider's view. Let me take a look at what's happening in the corridor. And I did kind of a land use analysis, and I looked at everything in the darker red. At this point, they decided that where they really wanted to focus was in the darker red, which is this B2 zoning. Can everyone see that? Okay. So the B2 zoning. So I did a little land use analysis and found out that you obviously have a lot of kind of personal services and service type uses that are in there. You have a number of restaurants, you have a number of retail, food sale types of things. You have a lot of those smaller businesses that support your day-to-day activities, your retail type of things that you need for convenience shops. You don't have any big boxes really in this area, okay? And that's, as a result, a lot of that's happened down along the Macedonia corridor in 82, if you've seen where that's grown, and you have that. But you have the new Roxino, which is bringing a different element and a different amount of traffic and flavor to the area. And so it's an opportunity to look at what's the appropriate mix here of businesses going forward in this entire corridor. So as we start talking about what are some of the challenges to getting the investment, or maybe having some of the businesses develop or redevelop in this area, we started looking at what's the size of the parcels, what's the property size that these businesses are located on. And the average size lot of these lots that are here in red, that front on Northfield, is a 40-foot wide, about 170-foot deep lot. Okay, that's a very small footprint. And what I did then is went through and said, well, you have businesses that are on more than one of those lots. And so for those businesses who have built on that area, and I'm sure some of you own some of that property that's out there, they've actually acquired multiple parcels in order to place their business on. Because to put a business on a 40-foot wide lot and to meet the parking standards and requirements is very difficult. You have a very small building. And in this day and age, probably it may be okay for some businesses, but for some of the redevelopment opportunities that may be coming along, it's a very small parcel. So what's already happened in your community is all these areas that are outlined in black, those are all parcels that are in common ownership. So someone's already acquired all the frontage between these two streets. They put all those lots together in order to build their parcel, in order to put their business on that property. But what we also found was that some of these businesses are short of parking, and that parking's become an issue for some of them, or it's been, the parking lots are very tight, and they're maybe very difficult to get in and out of. And so, one of the things we started thinking is, well, is there a way to provide more room and more opportunity for some of that parking to support the existing businesses? And then also, if there's going to be redevelopment or new development, is there a way to provide a little bit larger space for some of the businesses to come in, such as maybe a restaurant or maybe, you know, a small retail operation that has a larger parking demand than what a little 40-foot by 170-foot lot would allow. So I started looking at that and saying, well, okay, well, how can we deal with this? We knew from the beginning the council said, well, this B1 is a large zoning, it's a shopping center. At this point, we don't want to address that. They've got the parcel, they've got the land to do some stuff, but at this point, we're not going to address that. At this point, we're going to just address these parcels that have frontage on Northfield. A couple of the other things I looked at was that under the current zoning, there's no real significant buffer requirement between the residential properties and the commercial properties. So a lot of these, and I went and I viewed the backs of all of these properties, and some have some fences, some don't have fences, some have fences that have fallen down, some have some landscaping. It's really a hodgepodge of things that have happened over time. And so that the requirements that were in the code were not very significant in terms of protecting the residential properties that were to the rear of the existing commercial businesses. So one of my suggestions was, whatever we do, we need to encourage additional buffering and screening of the adjacent residential property in order to protect the neighbors from any future development. And lastly, one of the things we wanted to make sure was that kind of tried to dress up the appearance of Northfield Road. You know, make it look a little bit nicer so that all those thousands of people that are coming to the Roxino and are coming through Northfield Road, down Northfield Road, get a little bit different impression of your village, and maybe a positive impression of your village, to have maybe a little bit of landscaping, maybe some consistency in how all these properties over the long term are going to look. And so those kind of being the kind of general ideas, with the focus being on encouraging reinvestment, encouraging redevelopment, encouraging protection of the adjacent residential properties, and enhancing the overall look of the corridor, kind of became the pillars of what we were looking at and tried to do with any changes that we made or any amendments that were made to the zoning code. So with those kind of things in mind, I started looking at, well, what are your options to do, what you could do? Potentially you could rezone additional parcels, and that comes with a lot of challenges and a lot of issues. You could make these parcels, the zoning go deeper into the residential area, but then that creates some challenges with the properties that are now residential that would become commercial. Or, you know, we looked at some other unique techniques. And one of the things that the council asked me to explore was this concept of an overlay. Now what an overlay does is it doesn't change the zoning on the property that is currently the way it is. The zoning stays the same. But it allows for a different, through a very stringent review process, allows a property owner to ask the village to allow certain types of things to occur on that property that wouldn't normally occur in a residential area. Okay? So you can have overlays on residential properties, you can have overlays on commercial properties, you can have overlay zoning. It's a technique that allows for additional regulations and controls in a zoning category that wouldn't normally occur. So we started exploring the option of a zoning overlay. And so the first thing we said, well, if we're going to expand this property and allow these potentially allow some of these commercial businesses to do something on adjacent residential property, adjacent properties that are zoned residential, how do we want to allow that to happen? First of all, they would have to own the property. So if you own a residential piece of property right now that's adjacent to a commercial piece of property, you don't have to do anything. This zoning overlay won't affect you. If somebody buys your property, potentially one of the adjacent commercial properties buys your property, they then could have the right to do something with that property. So if you don't have to sell. It doesn't force anything to happen. As you can see, some of these property owners already own a number of parcels that are zoned residential. Right now, they're not able to build into that or to do anything with that property because it's zoned residential. You can't put commercial uses in a residential area under the current code. With this overlay, it's a potential that they could expand into that area with certain conditions. So one of the things we started looking at, well, what would we want to allow in that overlay district? And the council was very specific about not allowing commercial buildings and commercial structures to further build into any residential properties. So the only things that would go into any overlay would be things that would be supporting the commercial development. So that under the regulation would be parking, landscaping, and potentially a dumpster location. With certain restrictions and regulations, okay? And I'm going to walk through those with you here in just a minute. So the other thing was, they also said if the village is going to allow someone to do something in a residential piece of property, we want an improvement in the commercial piece of property. So it's not just we're giving something for the, we'll take some questions at the end, okay?
I just wanted you to repeat what you just said, I'm sorry.
Okay, if the village saying if you have if we're gonna allow an overlay into a residential piece of property, if they come and they request put parking on a residentially zoned piece of property, then they also want the property that's commercial to improve as well. So it's not just going to be, we're going to give you something and not get anything in return. If the objective here is to improve the overall look of the corridor and to enhance everything, then there needs to be some trade-offs here, and there needs to be some quid pro quo that if the property owner is getting something into the residential zoning, that the village wants something back in the commercial zoning. And those things would be some enhancement of the frontage along Northfield Road. So you all should have picked up when you came in a copy of the proposal, and what I'd like to do at this point is kind of run through the highlights of the proposed legislation that we've been talking about. And then what I can do is I can show you kind of some examples of how some of these things might happen. If there's, everybody's got one? I think there's a gentleman. Thank you. So first of all, the purpose and intent. If you see the purpose and intent, the four things that I just mentioned, that I mentioned to you previously, that we want to enhance the existing commercial area, that we want to promote proper economic development, enhancement of Northfield. We want to encourage the appropriate amount of parking for the businesses that are in that area, and we want to, most importantly, we want to protect the adjacent residentially zoned properties. So we're creating regulations to not only protect the investment, but also to protect the next adjacent residential property. Now, in order for someone to use this, as I said before, to use the overlay, it has to be a commercial property owner has to own the adjacent residential property. Okay, so you can't just lease your property to someone. There has to be an ownership requirement there. Okay, so no one's being forced to sell their property. You don't have to sell your property, but in order for the commercial property to expand into a residential area, they would have to own that property. And there would have to be no residential use on that property. So if there's currently a house on that property, then they would be responsible with removing that house in order to do this development. So you're not going to have a situation where you would have a residential house surrounded by parking. The house would have to come down. And the next thing was, well, how far into the residential property would the village allow someone to potentially go? How far down the street? How many lots? Most of the lots in the village in the residential area are, generally 40 to 80 feet in width. So we did a survey of the area, and the council suggested, and I suggested to the council that they allow it to go up to 120 feet beyond the last line of where the commercial zoning ends. In essence, that's 3 lots. That's potentially up to 3 lots. It's up to. It doesn't mean it has to go 120 feet. It could go 1 lot. It could go 2 lots. It could go 60 feet. It could go 45 feet. It could go any number up to 120 feet. That's the proposal at this point in time. And as I said before, in order to develop on the residentially zoned property with the overlay approval, you have to also make improvements to your commercial property at the same time. The permitted.
Can you define what upgrading commercial property?
I'm going to get to that. That's coming up next. Okay. The permitted uses in the overlay area, which would be 120 feet from the back of the commercial property, would be parking, landscaping, and fencing, and what is called waste disposal facilities, but with restrictions that are in the code for all of those things. Prohibited uses in that area would be any outdoor storage, any outdoor dining, any commercial building, and any residential uses. Okay? So, as I said, we created a whole set of development standards that if this is going to occur, and for the Planning Commission and for the Village Council to approve any overlay, use in the overlay, there's a whole set of development standards that would have to be met. The first thing is that the parking, any parking that would be in that overlay area, in that up to 120 feet, would have to be used in association with an associated business. Okay, so you can't have an open parking lot for anybody just parking. It has to be parking to support a business that's there. Parking's supposed to be generally screened from view. We want landscaping in the parking area. It has to be designed to flow right. We put some requirements in here that, all the standards in our parking code, section of the code would apply. So you have to have the right size parking stalls, the right size of drive aisles. If you have more than a parking in rows of more than 10 spaces, you have to break it up with some little bit of landscaping. That also allows an opportunity to get some additional storm drainage in there and to use those islands for some storm retention. They basically, and you have to meet all the standards of the off-street parking requirements. So you have to meet the parking code for the village. Now, in all situations, there needs to be buffering. And we say that buffering is required around the boundary of the overlay. So that means if this property is going into this area to build some additional parking in it, there has to be buffering on all the sides to protect any of the adjacent residential property. That means on the street side, on the back side, on the side adjacent to the residential property. And we go into some very specific detail about what that buffering requires. the buffering has to be taken care of by the property owner. No structures are going to be permitted in the buffering other than the fencing that is required. And no buffering area can ever be used for any sort of a display or storage or anything. The buffering is just set aside as a separate area to protect that adjacent residential property. And additionally, we wanted to make sure that on some of these side streets, that if they did do buffering, it wasn't of a height that was going to cause any sight distance if somebody pulled out of a driveway, and that, so we have some sight distance requirements that say how high the landscaping is going to be within so many feet of that driveway. Then we also said that the front setback adjacent to Northfield Road, so all this area on the frontage, these are the things that the business will be required to make improvements to in order to have the buffering, or to have the overlay in place. One of the issues that I observed, and I'm sure many of you have observed, there is a sidewalk on both sides of Northfield Road. It's a narrow sidewalk, it's right next to the curb, and it's right next to parking lots in most areas. There's very little landscaping or any sort of a buffer between the sidewalk and the parking area for where the businesses have their parking. And part of that is because the lots are so small, you're using every inch of property to meet your parking requirement. Well, if we're giving you more areas to put parking in, we want to get a little bit of a buffer in the front there. So someone walking down Northfield Road, and I've seen people walking down Northfield Road, doesn't feel like they're going to get hit from both sides. From that car coming in and out of in that parking space, or that truck or car running down Northfield Road at 35 or 45 or more miles an hour, that's right there next to the curb, okay? So one of the things that we're saying, if you're going to do this, we want to push your parking lot, we want a 5-foot strip across the front of the property that would be a landscape buffer strip. And what we're asking is that if the sidewalk's in bad shape at the time when you're doing this, as part of this project, you replace your sidewalk. As part of that buffer strip, we want like a little 1-foot paver strip next to the sidewalk to give it a little bit more feel of being a little bit wider area, so that you're not going to feel like you have to walk next to the curb.
So you're gonna leave the sidewalk right on the road?
The sidewalk's gonna stay right on the road.
You can't walk there anyways when the snow comes in,
So
Is there legislation for that?
I'm only talking about the buffering and
sorry,
this
but yeah.
overlay at this point in time. In that 5-foot strip, we're indicating that we would like some landscaping in that area. We'd like a couple of types of very smaller trees, some sort of landscape material. You have the option of doing a decorative fence in that area, like with the aluminum fences with the pillars. You don't have to do that. That's an option. And so if you do the fencing, we've got regulations for how high the fence should be, and if you're going to do it. If you're not, then we're just asking for some landscaping in that area. Okay. If you're on a corner lot, if you have a corner lot on the side street, we're asking for a 5-foot landscape strip as well. We are not requiring you to put a sidewalk in in this particular regulation. If there's a sidewalk there now, then we maintain the sidewalk, and there's a couple streets that have them, but most of them don't. And if you don't have a sidewalk, and if for this regulation, we're not requiring you to put any sidewalk in, but we still want from the edge of the right-of-way or your property line, a 5-foot little landscape buffer strip in that area, again, with some landscaping and potentially fence if you so desire. Okay? And if you're going to, on the side street here also, if you extend the parking into the residential area, and that parking's going to be across the street from a house now, because you're into the residential area. There's some additional buffering standards and requirements so that any headlights and things don't shine into the property across the street that still would be residential. So it's an attempt to buffer any of the impacts that parking lot could potentially have on that house that would be across the street from where now would be a parking lot. So the next set of buffering requirements, so those are the only types of standards and changes that would be required on the commercial property. Okay, just would be to do a little bit of landscaping around the outside of the property. On the residentially zoned property that would be part of the overlay, the requirement would be to have a buffer adjacent to the residential property that's a minimum of 10 feet in depth. And that buffer has to have a very detailed landscaping package with it. Also has to have an 8-foot solid white vinyl fence. Okay, so it's going to be a solid fencing. That fencing is to be a minimum of 1 foot off the residential property line. And then the landscaping, which is laid out in some great detail in terms of the quantity of each of the plants, the types of plants that are required along that buffer, would be installed in front of that fence. They didn't call out, we're not calling out specifically the exact style of vinyl fence, so there is some flexibility for the property owners to do what they want. And we also did say that in some instances, that top foot, if you've seen some of these vinyl fences where the top foot might be like an open basket weave or something like that, you can add some decorative elements to that vinyl fence if you so desired. Again, that would all be submitted as part of the package. There's a little chart that says how much plant material you have to have in depending on the depth of your buffer. The minimum is 10 feet. It could be more. It could be 15 or 20 depending on or 25 depending on what the property owner wanted to do and how much land he had or how much parking they needed. But it has to be at least a minimum of 10 feet, and there has to be a minimum amount of this landscaping. They can always do more. These are just minimums. And we gave some examples in the code of how things can be laid out and how many items need to be there. We also are calling out the size of the plant material, the quantity, besides the quantities, the sizes of the plant material, so that we get substantive buffering and not, just small little, little 1 pint little flowers that go in, and it's going to take 30 years for something to actually buffer. These things have to be substantive when they're going in. The next thing that we said is that we want to address lighting. Most parking lots have lighting in them, and if you're going to have lighting, we want to make sure that lighting doesn't spill over into the adjacent areas. And so we've set photometric limits on how much wattage can be on that parking lot. We've set height limits on the parking, the light standards in the parking area, and require that they have full cutoff fixtures, etc. Maximum pole height of any pole in a parking area is 20 feet unless it's otherwise approved by the Planning Commission and the Village Council. So if you can prove through a photometric diagram that you're not going to exceed the 0.1 foot candles at the property line, then you can have something different than that potentially something different than that 20-foot height. And the other thing we also said that the illumination of parking areas should only occur during business hours. So we're really not looking for these to be lit up parking lots all night long. And we're hoping that the businesses would be able to comply with that. Then we also said, dumpsters, waste disposal facilities can be a nuisance. And so we said, well, if they're going to end up, they always end up behind the building. So if they're going to end up behind the building, where you want them screened, you want them buffered. So we put some standards in there that says, one, that they will be located behind the building, and then that they're screened. They're not to be in that 10-foot buffer area, so they can't be that close to the property line. They should be located no more than 20 feet from the rear of the commercial building. So if your commercial building is it has to stay on the commercially zoned property, and you have 120 feet more of parking, the furthest that dumpster can be from the back of that building is 20 feet. It's going to be 100 feet from the closest residential property. The idea was we want it behind the commercial business, but we don't want it to put it way back in the corner next to the next residential property. We want to put it up closer to the business, which is more convenient for the business anyway, and it would be less intrusive, hopefully, to the adjacent residential property. It's to be surrounded by a solid masonry wall that is 6 foot in height and gated. So it's to be screened, buffered, gated, and kept as far away as possible from the adjacent residential property. The rest of the regulation that we propose is how you go through the approval process to get a permit to go into, to implement the overlay for your commercial business. There's a very detailed set of plans that would have to be submitted. The information is reviewed internally by all the appropriate officials of the city. It goes to the city's planning commission. The planning commission would make a decision on that particular proposal if it meets all the review criteria. And we've laid out 11 different, I believe it's 11 different review criteria, 10 different review criteria that the Planning Commission and the Council are to use to evaluate whether or not it's met the standards. Once the Planning Commission makes their decision, it then does come to the City Council, and the City Council makes the final decision on whether or not that overlay would be implemented. The property owner basically, at that point in time, they basically have 2 years to implement any overlay. If during that, after 2 years, they haven't built anything on that, but they haven't implemented, that is void, that approval is void, and they would have to come back and start the process all over again. Okay? So what I'd like to do right now is to very quickly show you a couple schematics and how this might look and how it might visually. So the first thing we did is I took a one block of this, is actually a block that's a catty corner across the street here, and just said, okay, what would happen if we implemented an overlay in this block, so we could kind of see what was happening. This is where the gyro place is, and the Dairy
Subway.
Yeah, in the subway are all over here. So what would happen is if they, in this instance, we said, well, let's go back just 2 parcels, okay, in this instance, and they would have to have a 10-foot buffer all along this side, which would have, a fence up against the residential property, and then a series of landscaping in front of that. They would need to make an improvement, a 5-foot strip all along the front here, what would be your landscape strip. It could have a fence adjacent to the front property, closer to the sidewalk. Here's that little paver strip that I talked about initially, then a fence, and then additionally some landscaping. There is the potential that they could do, something in the parking lot to enhance that as well, but so we just colored in an existing island that is there. And then this red area would be the area that would be the overlay. Okay, that would be where the additional property would be implemented as the overlay. The reason I picked this parcel, this block, was because this was an old gas station, I believe, and it's no longer there. It's a vacant piece of property. So right now, under your current code, you could get probably about a 6,600 square foot building on there, okay? Small retail operations, probably not big enough for any restaurant, not enough parking would be available in here. You could get on that you could get, under the current code, you would be required for a 6,600 square foot building to have 33 parking spaces. And you could fit, you can get your 33 in here, but you have to park everything. You have to park around everywhere. No, no buffering in the front.
Excuse me, I don't want me to interrupt you, but as you do all that parking, the people that are living in this house right there, when people come out and they're loud at night, and they're slamming car doors, and I just wanna know who's gonna buffer sound? That's my question.
Well, that's what the fencing and some of, some of the landscaping as it grows is what's going to start. We'll take your questions at the end. Let me just finish answering, presenting everything, and then I'll definitely, and those are things we want to hear from you, okay? So we want to hear those concerns. The proposal, under the proposal, if they did expand into this area and had this additional parking, you could now fit an 11,000 square foot building on that site. Now you've opened the ability for different types of commercial uses, maybe some restaurants, a variety of different types of things. A 10,000 to a 15,000 square foot building is your standard size building that people would build today in a general commercial area. So this now makes this a more marketable and a more desirable piece of property to develop, if in fact they are able to acquire these additional 2 pieces of property here. Okay? So, and then with that, they could buffer along the side. They would be required to buffer across the back. And then they could have parking in here. Under this new requirement, you would be required to have 57 parking spaces, or I'm sorry, 55 parking spaces, and I figured that you could fit 57 parking spaces in here without putting any parking in the front. All your parking would be along the side and the back. So you could, in fact, landscape or do something other up front. You could get some additional parking in the front as well, but you could leave the front to be a nice landscaped area if that's what you so desired. So with this, the village would allow that property to develop into something more revenue generating, income tax generating, etc., that could potentially benefit all the people in the village. So again, they would have the buffer landscaping around the frontage, and then the buffer at the back. So I had our graphics guy just do a couple little things to kind of show you what it might look like if you looked at adding what we showed here. There could be, potentially you could put some nice little fencing along here, some little bit of landscaping, maybe 1 or 2 trees, some nice flowering shrubs or plant material in that 5-foot strip that would really kind of change the appearance of what that looks like from Northfield Road. So the objective of trying to enhance the corridor and enhance the quality of the appearance of how that looks, as well as hopefully the pedestrian ambiance for the area, is what they were trying to achieve. And then secondly, I had them draw up a buffer of the rear property. This is all to scale. So this is the 8-foot fence with the amount of plant material that would be required for a 10-foot buffer. The cars obviously would be more than 10 feet away from that property line. We would have the ability to have parking. There still would be some impact to this next adjacent property because they now become the one next to the parking lot. But the attempt here is to try to minimize with the intensity of the buffer, the amount of that impact as much as possible. Okay? So lastly, just in summary, the idea here was to provide a tool for the village to encourage development, to enhance the pedestrian experience down Northfield Road, and to allow for some current businesses that have parking demands and needs right now to expand into areas to expand their parking and hopefully support those current businesses and allow them to develop and to encourage them to stay and grow within Northfield Village. So with that, that's my presentation.
Okay, and then if everyone has any questions, just if we can do it in an orderly fashion, whoever wants to speak up, if you can go up to the podium, hit the button, the red light should go on, state your name and tell us what your address is, and whatever questions or comments you have, we'd love to hear from you. And again, we want to try to limit it to 5 minutes a person so that everyone gets a chance to speak.
My name is Jim McGurr, and I live at 47 Summit Avenue. And so far, I've heard anything going to be done on the east side of Route 8, but my house is the third one on the left. I don't know how this buffer, so-called buffer, is going to benefit anybody that has a house. Nobody wants to have their house overlooking a parking lot. And regardless of how you put that fence up, you can put it up 100 feet, you're still going to have a parking lot beside your property. You lower that property value. There's no reason for it. I don't know what's going to happen to my property. Maybe you'll buy it, and maybe I don't have a clue. If you're talking about putting up a parking lot, I already got a big parking lot in my backyard from the rocks. I don't want another one. I don't think this is the right idea. Besides that, how many people are going to walk all the way from behind the building, go all the way around the front just to get inside? They're not going to have rear entry doors. This doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand what the reasoning is behind it. But whatever people are going to go along with, I don't think they'll go along with this. I might be sadly mistaken, but I don't think I am. You're going to decrease everybody else's property that live in the village. I've been here since 1972. And granted, maybe my property's not worth that much, but you're going to lower it to go ahead and improve your own. I'm sure there's other people who probably feel the same way. I might be wrong. Maybe somebody else will like this. I don't know. I don't. That's all I've got to say.
Thanks, Jim.
Sabrina Pines. I live on Lowry, 298 Lowry. I appreciate you looking into doing something. I see a lot of people shaking their heads no, but I appreciate you taking the time to have somebody look into it. My only thing is, it's if people sell their houses to these properties, and is that really going to happen? Are people really going to come knocking on somebody's door saying, I want to buy your property? I personally thought it would be something more of helping the landscape going down Route 8, what you might see, fences up, something to make it look nicer than what it does. I really don't think people need to worry about parking lots going in, because it would have to be a business that's been dying to get into the village, which aren't many, and knocking on the doors and saying, hey, could we buy your property because we need to put this parking lot in? I think we need to look more at, which I know you've all worked on with the plaza, that's huge. There's something that was just done in Portage Lakes or somewhere down in Cuyahoga Falls with where they made it look so nice. Old buildings that, they have banners up, and if we could somehow talk to the owner of the plaza and maybe have something like that done, would make a huge difference. I've lived here my whole life. It's just driving down Northfield, it looks crappy, and it's not that it's anybody's fault. It's just what's happened over the years and what people have been allowed to do. So that's just, I mean, I do appreciate you going out and getting somebody to, but, you know, with the overlay, it'd have to be somebody that really wants to come into the village, and I don't think that really is happening anytime soon, even though the casino's here. That's about the only good thing. I think we need to look at, you know, what can we do to the storefronts now, and I know you guys have been working on with the fences, their parking lots, signs, and it looks better, but I think we need to concentrate more on that than something where it's going to be, you know, somebody trying to buy parcels to put parking lots in. I don't think people need to worry about that as much as people are sitting here shaking their heads. No, let's look at what we can do. What can make a difference? That's all.
Yep. Thanks, Sabrina. And the only thing I would say is, you know, the Plaza property is not involved in this project, and it's a separate issue, but whether it's improvement to that property or anyone else, we're going to require the property owner to make a significant financial investment and put the money in. So we would love for something to happen at the Plaza, but without, you know, property owners putting in a significant financial investment to improve the property, there's nothing, you know, the village can do except try to facilitate some of these things and put in requirements to make things look better if they are.
Hi, I'm Betsy Rudd, and my husband and I live behind CVS, 23 Chestnut. And we've been here 19 years, so we've seen a lot in 19 years. Our house is only 18 years old, so it'd be really kind of sad to see a newer construction go down for a parking lot. CVS is a really good neighbor, and we knew that going in because they were there first, you know, so they had their chance to buy the two parcels next to us. I don't know how it was zoned, but, you know, they were there first. There is a light in their back lot because they have a dumpster there, and it does shine, and it doesn't bother me that much. It goes off around 10 o'clock. But I would think that if you have parking lots, and there's really no I mean, there's a couple spots there, and they have to drive through for the prescription thing, but I can't imagine having parking lots with no lighting. I think you can't have that at night. I mean, Spinato's or anybody's going to have people there, and you're going to have those back parking lots lit. I think that would just be common sense, in my opinion. And the other thing is, I just want to confirm and understand this is not like an eminent domain. CVS is not going to knock on my door and say, hey, okay, because I haven't seen a parking problem with them
No one,
so far.
you would not be required to sell your property. It would be completely up to you.
Okay.
And just to clarify with the lighting, just so everyone understands, it's when the business is open, you'll need lighting, but it would have to be some sort of automatic shut-off that, say, Spinato's closes at 11:30, the lights would go off, you know, at that time, so they're not on all night. But yes, the lighting would be on when the business is open.
So if CVS would send us a letter, it would be up to us if we wanted to sell, but no pressure.
Absolutely correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
If you have a couple more questions about the fence, well, I'll go say it.
Okay, your turn.
Well, I'm her husband. So anyway, my question is, well, first of all, she didn't finish about the back. You're wanting to put 55 cars to go in, and you want them to go in the back. And CVS, there's hardly ever anybody ever there anyway. They just pick up their prescriptions and turn around. And another question is, you said if you kept your property, you're going to make people put a bunch of trees in, 5 foot, and a bunch of flowers, and put a fence. In other words, spend about $10,000, $20,000 to decorate their place, or you guys are going to do it if we don't sell. Pardon?
It would be the business, not the resident.
So are you guys going to go encourage CVS to expand their place?
We're not encouraging them to, no.
Oh.
No, I might this is a tool that they would put on the books, that if a business owner wanted to come in and make it and expand or build a new building, that they would have this option, if they could acquire the properties. But it is not something that the council is going to do. It's not something that they're forcing anybody to do. It provides an option. Now, the businesses do not, if they don't put any don't expand, don't go into the overlay, this requirement requirement for the additional landscaping and stuff would not apply to them. It doesn't go into effect, only if they ask to expand parking into that overlay district.